In today's segment, we're going to talk about the Atkinson cycle engine. Now, the Atkinson cycle varies a little bit from the Otto cycle. The Otto cycle is our standard 4-stroke, 4-cycle internal combustion engine. The difference being in the Atkinson cycle, it actually uses a shorter compression stroke than a power stroke. So that way, when you're rising the piston up on compression, we're actually using less power because the stroke is shorter overall, so we don't waste as much power compressing the air-fuel mixture as we normally do. So, the Atkinson cycle really operates though at a net torque loss over the Otto cycle, but it can be more fuel efficient under low load conditions due to using that less energy on compression of the air-fuel mixture. We call this a lower pumping loss. Now, if we add a second power source like a motor generator to this, then the vehicle can make up the difference, so we get the much better fuel economy under low load conditions using the internal combustion engine, but we can also take off from a stop or accelerate normally due to the additional torque added by an electric motor generator, which is why an Atkinson cycle is really well suited to a hybrid application, and it's used on most of our hybrid vehicles now. We use a smaller engine, Atkinson cycling, so we get much better fuel economy under that low load cruising condition, but we have that additional power source to help us make up the difference. Now, here's an illustration of the original Atkinson cycle. You can see this is a whole lot more complicated than what we do now. What we do now is completely different. What we're going to do now is what we may often call late intake valve closing. I'm going to show you an example side by side in just a minute, but essentially all we'll do is keep the intake valve open a little bit longer so it's actually open during the compression stroke. While the piston is coming up, the intake valve is still open, so instead of building pressure in the cylinder, we're pushing the charge right back out into the intake manifold. It makes it easier to push the piston up, so we're not utilizing crankshaft energy. We're not stealing energy from the engine, in essence, to create our compression. They'll close that valve a little bit later. Now, because of that, that's where we don't get quite as much compression. We don't have as much cylinder pressure, so we don't get as much energy. However, on the flip side, the power stroke is still the same length. We don't change anything in the power stroke, so you still have the full normal stroke length to take advantage of the energy that is created. So here's a side-by-side comparison of what we would consider a pretty normal intake valve opening versus what an Atkinson cycling valve opening would look like. We have our Otto cycle on the left, Atkinson cycle on the right. We're starting at top dead center. Now as we drop down on the intake stroke, our intake valve opens. We're down at bottom dead center. Now as we're about to start back up, the Otto cycle intake valve closes right away, while the Atkinson cycle valve stays open for a good portion of the compression stroke. By doing this, it's actually pushing part of that charge out into the intake and doesn't suffer from as much pumping loss. Now, from bottom dead center up to about this point, that whole time the intake valve was open and it was just pushing that charge back out. So the engine is having to do less work pushing the piston up on compression top dead center. Now, just as a note, this is just a representation. That valve opening and timing is going to be different on different engines. Now, briefly, one more engine to talk about, and that's Miller cycle. Miller cycle is a lot like Atkinson cycle. Really, the biggest difference in a Miller cycle is we have some other form of a power adder in a Miller cycle, typically a supercharger. It's always going to be forced induction. Now, by its very nature, a turbo is not going to work as well in that application. A supercharger will work much better, but either one will do. We still have in the old school, either the shorter compression stroke and same length power stroke, or we hold that intake valve open a little bit longer than we normally would, so we lose a little bit of our charge back up to the intake, but we don't use the same energy compressing it. The difference now being we have a positive pressure most of the time in the intake manifold, and the additional help of that supercharger or other forced induction device to help offset the power losses by the change in the engine cycle. So in a light cruise condition, we get better fuel economy, we get the advantages of that smaller engine, while under load, with the addition of the forced induction, our power is pretty similar. Now that actually has been used in production engines. Mazda actually used it back in the 90s. They had a 2.3 liter V6 engine that was supercharged. They put it in the Millennia for about 4 years. Wasn't a real popular car. They didn't sell a lot, but it's been out there. This technology's been out there on the road. So both Atkinson cycle and Miller cycle, they're out there. From the outside of the engine, they're not going to look any different to you. It's how they operate where our difference lies. So hopefully you understand a couple of our different engine cycles a little bit better now than you used to. And with that, we'll catch you in the next video.